Do you? Yahoo. That was their tagline, and I'll tell you, to this day, every time I hear the name Yahoo, I can't help but yodel in my head. You all know what I'm talking about. Yahoo! That was fun. Alright, now I'm gonna bring everyone down because Yahoo is kind of a sad story. They were one of the first truly big names associated with the internet. They predated Google and Amazon and most of the big ones. Here's a couple of troubling facts that'll help express how far they've fallen. In 2008, Microsoft offered to acquire Yahoo for $44.6 billion, which would have been by far the biggest acquisition either one of them had been a part of. Yahoo said that they were not interested, so the deal never happened. Well, you see where this is headed. They probably should have taken that deal because less than 10 years later, in 2017, Verizon did buy Yahoo for almost exactly 10% of that previous offer. The price was $4.48 billion, and just to recap, they went from saying no to $45 billion to saying yes to $5 billion. I can't imagine that anything else can illustrate their fall quite as well as that. So today, I want to talk about the rise and the fall of an internet giant, how they grew so big, and what happened to them. The two guys responsible for starting Yahoo are Jerry Yang and David Filo. Jerry Yang was born in Taiwan, and despite not knowing any English, when he was 10 years old in 1978, he immigrated to the US with his family. By 1994, he not only spoke fluent English, he had completed his bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering at Stanford University and was now working on his PhD. On the other end, David Filo had a bit of a different background. He was born in the US, but the two found themselves in the exact same place. David was also working on his PhD in electrical engineering at Stanford, and in fact, the two of them had become good friends. A big hobby that they shared was sort of ignoring their studies a bit in favor of exploring the internet. Now remember, this is 1994, so that statement isn't exactly what you're picturing. The internet was in its early days and hardly even resembled what it looks like today. There was no Google or any popular search engines, so it was hard to get around. The websites were out there, but in general, the internet was an unorganized mess. Jerry and David knew this all too well, so they had an idea of starting their own website where they would post all of their favorite websites. It was not intended to revolutionize the internet, but rather simply make it easier for them to use and maybe some of their friends. It didn't take long before they had built it into an impressive directory. It had categories and subcategories, you could search it, and it served as an early way to navigate through the internet. They originally called it David and Jerry's Guide to the World Wide Web, but after only a few months they changed it to Yahoo. If you want to know where that name Yahoo comes from, it's a tricky answer. It's said to stand for Yet Another Hierarchical Officious Oracle, which to me is a very strange and complex way of describing it. It almost sounds like they started with the word and then tried very hard to assign a meaning to each letter. And I guess it's a takeoff of Yet Another Compiler, which was a popular computer program. I don't know about any of that, but when asked about it, Jerry Yang said, "We thought it fit well with what we were doing. It was irreverent. It was reflective of the Wild West nature of the internet. A lot of people found it easy to remember, and besides, it's exactly what me and Jerry are, a couple of yahoos." So they had all these reasons behind it, but when it comes down to it, I think it was simply a way to cut down on that lengthy 9-word name in favor of a catchy single word. Even though it wasn't their intention, they started attracting a lot of attention. By the end of their first year, over 170,000 people were visiting their site every day, and the number just kept growing. They found themselves in what I would imagine to be a very stressful situation. I mean, they knew about computers and electrical engineering, but not much about running a business, which makes sense because they never set out to start a business. For lack of a better word, they stumbled into a potentially huge opportunity. All at the same time, they were trying to perfect the directory, figure out how to turn it into a money-making business, and by the way, keep up with their PhD program in electrical engineering. It was too much. They eventually dropped out of the program and hired an experienced executive from Motorola named Tim Kugel to take over as CEO. He would run the business end of things, and those were some bold moves. A quote that I like from Jerry Yang Cheng himself says, "When I told my mom that I was stepping out on my PhD to start a company and basically sell internet advertising for a living, she wasn't too keen on the idea, but she supported me. These days, she doesn't complain very much, yet he is a billionaire now." Unlike many of their competitors, Yahoo was free to use. Early on, they raised about $1 million from investors to keep things running, but like Jerry said, internet advertising became the core of their business. They were getting a ton of traffic to their site, so companies were willing to pay Yahoo to place their ads on there. It was simple enough. By 1996, 2 years after it first started, everything was in place. They had the directory, they had the advertisers, and they had the management in place, and they were ready to take the next big step. In April of that year, they had a public stock offering, and after 1 day of trading, the market valued them at nearly $300 million. The stock price rose from $13 to $43 at one point, and that was one of the biggest first day trading gains of all time. That same year, they had their first nationally televised commercial, and that name Yahoo was starting to become very recognizable to the general public. And then they became the world's most popular website in 2001 and stayed on top for the next 5 years. Their peak revenue was in 2008 when they made $7.2 billion, which happens to be the same year that they famously turned down that offer from Microsoft. That's a lie, and I wish that there was a single glaring reason that we could look at that would perfectly encapsulate Yahoo's failure. But I'm afraid to say that that perfect reason doesn't exist. There's a lot to it, but the easiest way that I could make sense of it is by saying that Yahoo is not very good at making decisions. I know that's a broad statement, but we've already seen some of it, and I would like to explain that further. See, at its core, Yahoo is a portal. When you first get on the internet, you start out on the Yahoo page and go where you need to go from there. That first page is just filled with things that you can click on that'll lead you to different places. A great way that Yahoo sought to grow was to become the owner of all these different places. If you're looking to do some shopping, you can do it through Yahoo Shopping. If you need some stock quotes, you can do it through Yahoo Finance. Ideally, they would like you to have your full internet experience without ever leaving Yahoo. To build this collection of services, sometimes they would develop it themselves, but oftentimes it was simpler to acquire a company that already provided them. It allowed them to offer it faster, and they could focus their efforts on something else. As a result, it was hard for Yahoo to have a real focus. They became this blend of different internet companies that provided much different services, with the one common thread being that they were generally something that a Yahoo user might want to click on. An example of this working out well was in 1997 when they bought this company 411, spelled in a way that you would never guess, for $95 million. Yahoo bought this because they had existing email capabilities that led to the creation of Yahoo Mail. An example of this not working out quite as well was in 2002 when they bought Hot Jobs. Do you remember Yahoo Hot Jobs? Well, they bought it for $436 million and then sold it for $225 million 8 years later. They had over 100 of these acquisitions, and it was a real mix of good and bad ones, but let me point out some of the excessively bad ones. Broadcast.com. It was this internet radio company that Yahoo bought in 1999 for the price of $5.7 billion, which must sound like a high price for something that I'm guessing most of you have never even heard of. Mark Cuban was actually on the winning end of that deal, so if you have heard of it, that's probably why. In short, Yahoo hardly did anything with it and then shut it down a few years later. Another bad one was buying GeoCities in 2002 for $3.56 billion. That was like a website building service that, again, was just not worth the price. In 2013, they bought Tumblr, the micro-blogging site, for over $1 billion, and things just haven't gone well. They made these very weak, half-hearted attempts to get involved in social media, but not surprisingly, they all fell short. And then on the other end of this, we have a few acquisitions that could have been huge for Yahoo, but they turned them down. Like owning Google would have been big. They actually had multiple opportunities to either become heavily involved in them or purchase them entirely. Notably, in 2002, they could have bought it for about $3 billion, but refused. Which I know sounds like a lot of money, but knowing what we know now, that could have been the deal of the century. Facebook is another one. It's a little more complex because Mark Zuckerberg was never fully on board with it, but it's believed that they could have bought Facebook for around $1 billion in 2005. They actually made that offer and then lowered it, so the deal obviously never happened. Now, I normally don't like putting too much emphasis on these missed opportunities. It's so easy for all of us us to feel smart by looking back at someone else's oversight and making fun of them for it, but that's not fair. If any of us were actually in that position at that time, it wouldn't have been such an easy decision. With that being said, I'm just gonna point out that Yahoo could have been the owner of Google and Facebook for significantly less money than they paid for Broadcast.com. A few other reasons that may be worth mentioning is maybe their failure to get involved with smartphones. That is a big part of their market that they were late to. How about changing leadership? It's like when a basketball team gets a new head coach every other year. They know that changes need to happen, but they just can't get it right. Yahoo found themselves changing their CEO just about every other year, most of which were heavily criticized. It's probably not the cause of the issues, but it could have made things worse at a pivotal time. Alibaba is another thing we could look at. It's a popular Chinese e-commerce company that Yahoo bought heavily into back in 2005. I'll admit it was a good investment, but probably didn't do much to help their core business. In fact, the Alibaba thing became the main part of their business. There's just so much to talk about here, but let me try to summarize things. A big reason that they grew so large in the first place was because they were one of the first. Going back to the mid-90s, they offered this free and effective way to spend your time on the internet. As the internet grew, so did Yahoo. But as the competitors came, such as Google or Facebook, that, by the way, both use the same model where it's free but they use ads, it didn't take much for them to fall behind. Yahoo is still around today. It's owned by Verizon, but it'll never be like it was. So we can say that stronger competition, poor selection of acquisition targets, splitting their attention into too many directions, at many times in the wrong directions, complicated by questionable and changing leadership, can all come together to help explain the decline of Yahoo. Let me know in the comments, do you agree with my reasons behind the downfall of Yahoo? Now, it's not a complete list, it never is, but does it hit on the main reasons? Also, were you a Yahoo user? I'd like to hear about that experience, and if you left them, I'm curious as to why. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Alright, that got too depressing, so let's end this on a happy note by playing that yodel one more time. You just can't hear it without smiling. Alright, thank you for watching.